The Conservatives are facing accusations of Islamophobia in their ranks. The Prime Minister says increasingly threatening behaviour towards politicians and on the streets is leading to mob rule. Is he right? Or is that kind of language making things worse? Tonight, we're in Croydon in South London, an area of rich history, having been home to both Henry VIII and Arthur Conan Doyle, as well as the UK's first international airport, way back in 1920. Our audience tonight, as always, is a broad reflection of the electoral picture across the nation. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Baroness Sayeeda Warsi is a Conservative peer and the first Muslim cabinet minister. She's been outspoken about what she sees as her party's problem with Islamophobia. And from today, she presents a politics and culture podcast with David Baddiel called A Muslim and a Jew Go There. Labour's David Lammy wants to be the next Foreign Secretary and could be before the year's out if his party wins the next election. He was a minister under Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown's leadership and has written books on the London riots and political tribalism. Caroline Lucas is one of the most recognisable faces of the UK Green movement and the only Green Party member to be elected to the House of Commons. The Brighton MP has twice led her party, standing down as leader most recently in 2018. And Tim Stanley is an historian, author and journalist. He's a sketch leader, writer and columnist at the Daily Telegraph and a regular panellist on Radio 4's Moral Maze. Good evening. Welcome to our panellists. Welcome to the audience here. Great to see you in Croydon. And, of course, welcome to you at home. You can catch up with the programme on BBC Sounds, on the iPlayer. And, of course, there's always a pretty lively conversation going on social media as well. Right, let's kick off with our first question, which is from Graham Fillmore.
Should everyone, including politicians, have the right of free speech to express their opinion, even if others find it unpalatable?
So, Graham, I know because I checked with you beforehand that one of the reasons that you're asking this question is because of the comments made by the former Conservative Party Deputy Chairman Lee Anderson, MP, who said this week, Islamists have got control of Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. They've got control of London. They've got control of Starmer as well. Khan has given our capital city away to his mates. And the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, also added her voice. She said, the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. Keir Starmer is in hock to the Islamists. Sayeeda.
Well, freedom of speech is one thing. Talking absolute trash is something else. And when politicians make comments like that, which have no truth to them, have no evidence base to what they're saying, and they're simply being used as a way to incite and divide communities, that's wrong. Politicians have a responsibility. We have a public platform. We have the privilege of office. And we have to take that public office and that privilege incredibly seriously.
So Lee Anderson says, I mean, these are his words, he says, I am not a racist. And neither the Prime Minister nor prominent cabinet ministers have said that Lee Anderson is a racist. They've said they have a problem with what he said and it's unacceptable. Do you think what Lee Anderson said was racist? What
Lee Anderson said was a clear anti-Muslim trope. It was the stereotyping of a community, and if it was used in relation to any other community, we'd obviously recognise it as racist, and therefore, for him to suggest what he was saying about Sadiq was clearly racist. And I think what's disappointing is that every organisation and institutions has individuals amongst it who may have unsavoury views, even racist views. But we're not going to be able to root all of those out. What an organisation has to do is when it sees them, it has to call them out and say, this is unacceptable, this is racist, and we will not tolerate it.
So why do you think the Prime Minister wouldn't do that? I mean, he took away the whip from Lee Anderson, but he has specifically not, even when questioned, called that language racist.
Yeah, for me, it's been so disappointing to see colleague after colleague come out this week on television and just say it was simply wrong. I mean, we've almost invented this new form of racism now called wrongism, because we don't want to call it out for what it really is. And in a lot of ways, this week, Fiona, actually, has been difficult, but it's also been positive in the sense that for the first time, colleagues who have talked about this privately, like the ex-Chancellor, Sajid Javid, or people in the wider kind of right space, people like Ian Dale and others, have actually finally said enough. And so there have been more people calling this out and calling it unacceptable and racism. And unfortunately, this has been a long, hard battle. This has been going on for 7 or 8 years. The party have had the opportunity to deal with it. They failed to deal with it. In fact, they have people at the highest office now perpetuating this racism, and we've got to turn around now and say enough is enough.
OK. One last question, Dale, I'll come to you. When you say, you're saying this as a Conservative peer, when you say the highest office tolerating this kind of racism, who do you mean specifically?
I think the Prime Minister, by not calling out this racism, unfortunately, has tolerated it. And for me, as a person of colour, when the Prime Minister was elected, this was a huge moment for us. This was the first time we had a Prime Minister of colour, and it would be tragic, Fiona, if his tenure was really defined by it being mired in racism.
David?
Look, I definitely think we all want to live in a society where people are free to speak, they are free to offend, and that means sometimes on issues of religion, faith, sexuality, a whole raft of areas, people sometimes will offend, and we've got to defend the freedom to speak. But what we're seeing in politics at the moment is a nastiness. It's a cruelty. It's people in public office spreading conspiracy. There are big issues.
Are you including the Corbyn government in that?
You can see it on the extreme left, and you can certainly see it on the right, and I worry about what's happening to the Conservative Party. It's clear to me that as we head towards a London election, the state of our transport, housing issues in London, crime, these are legitimate areas of dispute and concern. But to give the impression that Sadiq Khan, who I think has tried to govern for all Londoners, whatever judgment Londoners make about him having a third term, to give the impression that he is in the pockets of the community from which he's from is shameful, nasty, mean. And it's the politics of division which we're seeing time and time again, which tears us apart and doesn't speak to the London that I've grown up in. This is a city where everybody has a place and everyone can make it. That's the London that I think we should defend. Lee Anderson's statements were shameful, and he should have been reprehensibly held to have been Islamophobic and racist in his intent, which is what I think was going on.
There's a number of hands. I'm going to come out to you in a moment. Tim, let me just bring you in first. So Graham's question, just let me remind you, should everyone, including politicians, have the right of free speech to express their opinion, even if others find it unpalatable? You know, where are the boundaries there?
Oh, well, the difference is between unpalatable versus illegal or discriminatory. That's the distinction. Gosh, this is such a tricky issue, and I feel I can almost feel myself being cancelled before I begin to speak. But what Lee Anderson said was just wrong, right? So let's start with that. It was stupid and thick. The accusation that Sadiq Khan is controlled by Islamists is absurd. Only a few days before, Sadiq Khan had named the overground lines after the women's football team and a former HIV/AIDS hospital. So if Islamists are controlling him, they're not doing a very good job. I mean, it made no sense. But he wasn't alone. Paul Scully also said this strange thing about parts of Britain being no-go areas. And he then immediately had to backtrack and apologise, probably again quite rightly, because the idea that there are literally places where you can't physically go is absurd. But I think what the Tories are trying to do is put their finger on a phenomenon which they themselves are struggling to define because it's very vague. And I think if Lee Anderson were here right now, picking up on your point about nastiness, David, he would say that he was responding to what he regards as the nastiness of certain protests and political pressure being placed upon MPs. He would say there are plenty of Jewish Londoners who right now don't feel happy or safe within London because of the ongoing protests. There are, of course, also MPs who have been forced to get security. And I think what they're trying to put their finger on is a couple of phenomena. One is the very real problem of small but significant Islamist pressure groups, which may be attempting to shape or shut down political debate. And the other issue, which is very difficult to define, but is this sense of Britain growing apart, and that there are certain that communities. And I know you'll say the Tories are fueling that by what they said.
Yes, they're driving it.
No, fair enough. OK, but here's the thing. We go back to the point. But
you can finish your point.
But I'm sorry, if it's a reality and it's happening, then we have to address it and discuss it. And I began by saying what he said was wrong. It was wrong. But let's not run away from the context of what he said, which is a couple of weeks in which MPs have been threatened, in which a debate in Parliament was effectively shut down, and many people feel in this country that they can't speak their mind. And they feel that it's becoming very difficult for them to articulate how they feel about certain subjects. Let me put it this way. I'll throw out a provocation. If I were to come onto this programme and say I thought Jesus Christ was a fraud, the most I would receive is a couple of angry letters from Tunbridge Wells. If I were to say something analogous about Islam, and note that I don't even have the courage to put into words what that might mean, I would very probably face threats of violence. That's nasty. That needs to be called out too.
OK, I'll come back to you on that, Sayeeda. Let's hear from our audience. It's the man at the back with the... Yes, you with the grey jacket on.
I think there's a few things. Firstly, I think people who go on about free speech don't understand that freedom of speech does not mean having no freedom from consequence. You can, say what you want, but people are going to, react a certain way, and you're going to face consequences of what you said. I think more broadly speaking, I think the anti-Islam rhetoric of the Tory party is something that is a big problem. A lot of people who are on the right of the party don't think Islamophobia is an actual sort of thing, because they think it's a made-up word to kind of, just like defend. It's not right. And I think, quite frankly, there needs to be a situation where people are able to, people who are Muslim are just able to just live and not have people like, I don't know, Lee Anderson say such disgusting things like that, personally. So that's my opinion.
OK, thank you. Yes, a woman there. Yes, with the scarf, yeah.
While I recognise that anti-Semitism is an issue in the UK among politicians, but also among the general public, and I know lots of people would agree with me, anti-Semitism is an issue that not only exists, but needs to be dealt with sympathy. However, do you think that politicians in this country are almost overcompensating the issue and has actually led into Islamophobia and has caused politicians like Lee Anderson and others among him to actually tip into Islamophobia as a result of perhaps overcompensating the issue which exists of anti-Semitism?
So prioritising one sector of the population over another.
I think what we should expect from our politicians is leadership, and I think leadership in lots of different ways, but picking the language that they use in a sensible and mature way, rather than curtailing to popularism for an easy vote, is something that we should all be expecting.
So when the Prime Minister said yesterday, I think it's reported in the papers today, that he warned of the risk of democratic rule giving way to mob rule, how do you respond to that?
I would say that he needs to look at his own actions and some of the decisions that he's made during his leadership and some of the things that he's supported, and look at how the Tory party in general has stoked that mob. Before they use language like that and question democracy, I think they've got a real part to play in that, and they should be leading us to a better place.
OK, Caroline.
Well, on that in particular, the Prime Minister's words on this mob rule are the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, and if we're looking at who is acting like a mob right now, frankly, it's the people who are supposed to be running the country. It really matters the kind of language that the Prime Minister uses, that the Deputy Chair of the Tory party uses. Language really matters, and what concerns me is of course it was wrong, but it was worse than wrong, and it should be named as anti-Muslim hate, as Islamophobia, because naming it matters. And it was excruciating, frankly, listening to, I think it was Michael Tomlinson, 6 times refusing to say why it was wrong to say what Lee Anderson said. And the Tory party's inability to name that really worried me. But I think what's really going on here is something far more dangerous than Lee Anderson just, accidentally perhaps using anti-Muslim tropes. What's happening, I think, is a very deliberate strategy by this government to lurch to the hard right in order to try to prevent some of their MPs going off to join Reform. I think what's happening is deeply, deeply dangerous, because what used to just be a dog whistle is now, frankly, a bloody great foghorn and a megaphone. And it is causing lots of anxiety. We know that the numbers of cases of anti-Semitism have risen 6-fold since the awful atrocities back in October. The number of hate crimes against Muslims has increased 3-fold. Language has consequences. And I think we absolutely need to call out this unelected Prime Minister who is leading one of the most unpopular governments in all time. And he is deliberately, divisively using this language to divide our country and pull it apart. And we have to call that out. Otherwise, it's going to end in a grim way, I think.
Sayeeda, can I just come back to you? I'll come back to you. Okay. Sayeeda, I should give you an opportunity to respond to what Tim was saying. And Tim was using the analogy, correct me if I misrepresent what you said, Tim, but if you were to say Jesus Christ was a fraud, you might get a few complaints, but frankly...
Careful,
not very much. If you said something similar about Islam,
yes.
The kind of response you worry you might get, would it be as acceptable to to say something like that?
I think Tim's understanding of Islam is so fundamentally flawed. The great tradition of debate, discussion, disagreement is a fundamental part of the faith. There has always been huge discussions and debates and disagreement. And in fact, one of the things that the parliamentarians who came up with the definition of Islamophobia, which is a cross-government definition, the 2 things that they made absolutely clear was that this definition was in no way there to protect Islam. It was there to protect believers, and that definition
it would therefore be acceptable to criticise it as a religion if one wanted to.
I do it every single week. I have conversations every single week about how you interpret that particular verse, how that would be seen, how women's rights were seen, what the history was in relation to LGBT rights. These are conversations that are happening every single day, every single week in countries around the world. But you know what we try and do? We perpetuate this trope about Islam and Muslims. We try and present them as somehow slightly less sophisticated, underdeveloped. It's all part and parcel of what we've been seeing from certain right-wing media, from certain think tanks, from certain members of the public. And it's because there is a clear strategy to other this community. 2 grandfathers lost their lives in this country because they were attacked because they were Muslim. We've just heard the statistics from Caroline. This is real. This has real-life consequences. In the last 7 days, we've had 3 far-right extremists arrested for planning a terrorist attack against... They were looking for an Islamic institution to attack. This has real-life consequences, and I have spoken to my colleagues over and over again that, look, this is either 2 things. Either my colleagues are so dim that they cannot understand the consequences of what they're doing when it's staring at them in the face, or they are doing this deliberately to divide communities, to other this community because they think it's an election strategy. Exactly. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous. It's got to stop.
Tim, you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think the government is deliberately doing this because it immediately sacked Lee Anderson and it's embarrassed by the row and it's struggling to find, as I said, the right language to describe precisely why it is offended and why it was also wrong. Don't mischaracterise my views on Islam. I've written a great deal about the subject. You've got on your panel, I think, possibly for instance, the only Telegraph writer who has said there should be a ceasefire in Gaza and that Benjamin Netanyahu should go. I am very sympathetic towards, admire and respect Islam. Your characterisation of it is correct. It has many schools. It has a great deal of debate within it. It has had many reformations. And it really saddens me how it is misrepresented in this country. I'm not talking about Islam. I'm talking about a small group of people within it, political ideologues who use threats of violence to try to impose one particular view upon other people, including non-Muslims and many Muslims, because there is a great deal of hate directed towards Muslims by other Muslims. That is a problem. It is real. And I just come back to the context for this whole discussion is that a debate in Parliament was shut down because of fears about the safety and security of MPs who feel that they cannot express themselves. So I know you would deny that, of course. So the question was about being able to say the unpalatable. That's what I'm pushing here. This is what is definitional to the West, is that so long as one does not encourage discrimination or violence, one should be allowed to interrogate ideas and religions. That's what I think the government is trying to cling to here. That's why it struggled to precisely define what it didn't like about Lee Anderson and what he said, because it's trying to maintain the right to criticise ideas and political movements.
All right. Caroline, you forgive me, there's quite a lot of hands up, so I'm just going to go around to the... Yes, at the very back, there's two people. One's... You've got sunglasses on, I can see. I know these lights are bright. I didn't know they were that bright. But anyway, off you go.
I promise I have a licence to wear these. They're not sunglasses.
Oh, forgive me.
I just want to start by saying I really commend Sayeeda because I think she has the patience of a saint to remain in a party that is actively hating people like her. So, I mean, well done to you. God bless you. But I think the first important point I want to make is if it looks like a duck, if it says Sadiq Khan, who is a Muslim who is brown, is being controlled by Islamists, it's an Islamophobic duck. And you have to be able to say that. Why is that important? Caroline already said. And for me, what's really wild about this entire debate is that people are forgetting that Lee Anderson is the very same man who about 18 months ago was on, I think, GB News or one of these other fringe media sites, talking about how the government does not have a concrete plan for the general election. So they are going to fight this election on culture wars. This is a culture war issue. But the last thing I'd like to raise is that I believe it was some Tory minister on LBC yesterday talking about how, in similar lines to Tim, you know, we should be able to critique a faith and we should be able to critique people who are part of this faith, you know, without being discriminatory. But people seem to be forgetting that we've been members of the Labour Party. I'm not a member of any political party, but I just want to say, members of the Labour Party who are critical of Israel have been expelled from the Labour Party because they have been literally for really spurious reasons up until just a couple of months ago. So it's really interesting for me to look at David because you're also complicit in creating this atmosphere, this McCarthyist environment where people feel like people are not allowed to have contrary opinions. If we are, you know, this great Western society where freedom of speech is important, then of course we must be able to critique political Islam, Islamists who do send threats to people. We should be able to say, not all Muslims are Islamists. I live in Tower Hamlets. There's no no-go areas in Tower Hamlets. It's a great borough. And equally, we should also be able to say that the nation, the government of Israel is committing really, really horrific acts against a civilian population. And people should not be expelled from the Labour Party. They should not be expelled as councillors, as actually a Jewish councillor from Lambeth Labour Party was only recently expelled.
Well, should we give David... You make your point so cogently. Shall I give... No, not at all. Please, honestly, you make your point so well. David, would you like to respond?
Well, look, the point is made well, and the earlier parts of what you said I would agree with, but I do have to come back on the Labour Party. I'm sorry, but I was there under Jeremy Corbyn. It was ugly, it was nasty, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. I was threatened with deselection because I wanted to defend and support Jewish brothers and sisters. I've been an anti-racist all of my life, fighting racism wherever it's found. And I'm afraid we do have to stand up to some of the nastiness that is, I'm afraid, in a segment of our party, and we have to be absolutely clear about the rules. That does not mean that you can't criticise the state of Israel. That does not mean you can't criticise Bibi Netanyahu. That does not mean you can't question aspects of a religion, Judaism. Of course you're free to do all those things. But when you cross over into anti-Semitism or racism or Islamophobia, we have to be clear about that as a political party. You're free to go somewhere else, somewhere else, but you're not free to peddle that within the Labour Party. We've got to be clear about that.
Right, Caroline, you want to come back in?
Obviously, I agree about not peddling anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, but I did just want to pick up, David, on the point that the lady at the back raised about the councillors in Lambeth, because as I understand it, there were 4 Labour councillors in Lambeth who've been suspended simply for supporting a ceasefire motion, a Green motion, as it happened at Lambeth Council. Now, surely that is going to the other extreme, to start suspending members for supporting a ceasefire motion. That is supposed to be Labour Party policy in any case. So I think there needs to be some consistency here, and I do think that Labour is being incredibly draconian with some of its members when they do want to be able to represent their constituents, the vast majority of whom want a bilateral ceasefire now, and recognise that there's, hiding behind mealy-mouthed words doesn't actually help the people who are suffering in so many numbers right now in Gaza. So let's allow councillors, for heaven's sake, to be able to support a ceasefire if that's what their constituents are asking.
Really briefly, David, really briefly.
I don't know the circumstances in Lambeth, but what I do know is the position of the Labour Party is that we support an immediate humanitarian ceasefire now. The fighting has to stop now.
So why were they suspended?
Well, that's why I'm worried about the caricature. But that is the Labour Party position. We want an immediate humanitarian ceasefire now.
All right. And that, too, is a subject I do not doubt that we will come back to, and rightly so. Let me move on, but before I do, I just want to tell you where we are next week. So we are in Cardiff next week, and the week after that we're in Liverpool, and then the show after that, which is our last one for the Easter break, is Middlesbrough. So Cardiff, Liverpool, Middlesbrough. If you would like to be in the audience for any of those 3 programmes, if you live in those cities or thereabouts, go to the Question Time website. These are the details, and we'd love to see you. Right, let's take our next question, which is from Khalil Jama. There you are.
With public services in dire conditions, is it the right time for the Chancellor to be finding cash for tax cuts?
Public services in dire conditions, is it right to be finding cash for tax cuts? There's all sorts of speculation, isn't there, in the press this week being floated around, coming from various sources about tax cuts, maybe a 1p reduction in national income, in national insurance, maybe 1p off the basic rate of income tax, maybe scrapping the non-dom tax rate. Anyway, let's see. David, is it right for the Chancellor to be finding cash for tax cuts?
I think that in a cost of living crisis, with the highest tax burden that we faced in our country, I think a lot of people will be very, very worried that Jeremy Hunt, in some of the speculation that we're reading in the press, might be tempted to go down the road of Liz Truss. Now, that is a matter for him and Rachel Reeves.
Hang on. They're suggesting a 1p off national insurance or 1p off the basic rate of income tax isn't necessarily going down the road of Liz Truss, which I would argue is putting a bit more of a bomb under the whole thing.
Fiona, you've done a great job defending Jeremy.
Well, no, it's not my job to defend Jeremy, and I'm absolutely not trying to do that. I'm simply putting the other point of view.
Well, let me put the other point of view. You know and I know that in the run-up to a budget, what the Tories will do is fly a kite about a whole range of policies, try and excite their base to see if something will go down. None of us know what's in the budget until we get there. But we do know that there's been a debate in the Conservative Party about tax cuts, and that debate has now rumbled on for several years. At the same time, people are really feeling the squeeze. But the only way out of this is growth in our economy, and we have been in recession under them. So this is on them, and what the British people now need, frankly, is a general election. We need...
So should I assume then that we wouldn't be seeing tax cuts under a Labour government should you get in?
I've been around a long enough time to tell you that I'm not here as a shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer to start predicting what is in... Well, I'd love to... Caroline, are you really going to start telling us what your plan is on the budget?
I can certainly tell you, David, that the Green Party would not be proposing tax cuts at a time when public services are absolutely decimated, when hospitals have huge waiting lists, when schools are literally crumbling, when universities can't cope because they can't manage to manage their books. I can absolutely tell you that the Green Party would be prioritising investment in vastly needed public services, not cutting taxes.
And Are you going to suggest where the money's going to come from to do that?
I would love to, David. I would love to challenge you on why the Labour Party has moved away from a wealth tax.
No.
A wealth tax is one of the things that in many other countries they pursue that and they look at the tax burden. Well, I shouldn't call it a burden. It's the responsibility of paying tax. And they recognise that some of the richest people in our society do not pay a proportionate amount of tax relative to the amount of money that they have, not just in their income, but in terms of their assets. So why is the discussion of a wealth tax such a taboo in this country? They have a wealth tax in Switzerland, in Norway, and lots of other countries where it's not brought the sky falling down. We should have a proper discussion about where the money comes from to invest. And one of the ways it can come from is from people who have more and earn more.
OK. Sayeeda, with public services in dire condition, is it right for the Chancellor to be finding cash for taxes? I mean, there's all sorts of kites being flown about tax cuts that might be circulating around, testing the temperature of the response to those. Is it right to be...
Well, I've sat in the Cabinet for enough years when the budget is about to come up. And actually, with the budget, nobody knows until we know. What comes out in the budget is actually kept very close, and the final decisions will probably be made this weekend.
But be that as it may, would it be right for him to do it? That's the question.
When they get their final figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility. I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, I think it's important to as a Conservative, my instinct is to have a low-tax economy. My instinct is to have that in the background of a stable economy. My instinct is to make sure that we have the money to be able to furnish our public services. But I think one of the interesting things that's been announced in all of this, which I think will probably, satisfy lots of people from different political divides, is a non-dom tax. Is to actually say that if you are resident in the United Kingdom, but you're pretending not to be, but actually you are living here, and you're living here and trying not to pay your tax here, then you should be.
I mean, Labour's been suggesting that for ages, as you know.
And I would be really interested to see, and do not write that off, this would actually be quite an interesting moment for us to say that if you live in this country, you use the services in this country, you're actually a part of our nation, then you should be paying all your taxes on all your income in this country, and that's what I would like to see as well.
So when Jeremy Hunter said hitherto, because Labour has talked about this a lot, and Jeremy Hunter said hitherto there's a terrible idea, he's wrong about that.
I wouldn't rule it out completely. I think there's a lot of discussion.
So he was wrong about that then?
Well, look, the Prime Minister, Prime Minister's wife was somebody who was in that status and then changed it. And I think the Prime Minister might be thinking, well, if my wife is now no longer having the advantage of that and she's paying, maybe everybody else should too as well.
OK. Can I come to yours and then I'll come back to you? Is that all right? I promise I will. Please. I promise I will. I've completely lost it. Oh, yes, man there in the shirt, yeah.
I'm just interested in terms of this tax question, what any of the parties are planning to do about all of the offshore wealth that politicians and some of the richest people in this country have been hiding in places like the British Virgin Islands, and whether you're planning to try and recoup some of that to help put back into public services.
OK, BVI, the Cayman Islands, that kind of thing. Yes, in the corner there with the white shirt. Yes, and the glasses, yeah. Yes.
Hearing David talk to Caroline just then, I don't think he realises how much it sounds like the exact things that the Tories have been saying to Labour for the past 15 years. And got to, when he asks where the money's going to come from, and Caroline come up with some really exciting ideas that I think a lot of people would be very excited to hear, he doesn't realise that how the Labour Party now sounds kind of bankrupt of ideas. And we don't see any concrete plans from the Labour Party, seeing them reversing on the 28 billion for the green investment. I just want to know what Labour would actually do. OK, and I will give David, I'll give you a chance to answer. Let me hear just a little bit more. The man in the blue shirt there, almost at the back, yeah.
Yes, so I actually kind of want to defend Labour a bit here. I think what he was trying to say, rather, is that, at the end of the day, the country is in a bit of a dire situation. And I think, especially in times like these, when it is very uncertain, I think it's 4 out of 5 schools are collapsing and the NHS is on its knees, we do need concrete plans going forward. And I think, especially in an age where politicians do kind of take the electorate for granted and just say what they need to do, we do need these plans out in the open. We can't just be making these promises. We do need to, hold politicians to account and get these clear plans that we can see they're following and whether or not they're following them through.
OK, woman here in the green jacket.
With a criminal justice system that is failing and only prosecutes for just over 4% of domestic abusers, and an NHS with waiting lists going on for over 2 years at times, why should there be an expectation of a tax cut, and why are people not willing to invest in their own country for the benefit of themselves and others? I think it's fair enough.
OK. Dave, I promise I'm going to come to it. Just let Tim, because Tim hasn't spoken.
I think to answer that question, it's because it's my money. And the government already takes a great deal of it. We have the highest tax burden we've had since the war in this country. And that's a legacy of a Conservative government, by the way. And I hope that Labour will cut those taxes at some point. There is a tension in the Tory brain between two views of, one, do we just try and run the economy really well, which means balancing the books? Is it all about sort of fiscal conservatism and making sure everything adds up and being able to finance everything? And that's the view which was largely won out under Rishi Sunak. That's his sort of perspective. And then the other side of the Tory brain is the Liz Truss view, which is that part of the problem why we are not growing is because of taxes. And if you take that view, then you actually can't afford high taxes because they end up killing growth. And the more taxes you introduce, the more you disincentivize people to work, or the more you discourage people from investing in this country, or like non-doms coming here to work, etc. So it's very difficult for the government to decide between those two things. But I come down to we all want to finance public services well. Of course we do. We already, though, have this incredibly high tax burden, and we're failing to do that. And our economy is not growing properly.
I mean, it's low, Tim, it's low relative to some countries, the amount of tax we pay in terms of France, the Scandinavian countries, Germany.
If you want to pay more, you can volunteer to pay more, and good for you. But ultimately, we're listening here to politicians discussing what to do with your money. And I just think it's incumbent upon a Conservative government, if it can afford to, without undermining public services, of course, to give the people back a little bit of their own money.
OK. David, let's get you back in here. So obviously the point made by the man over there, and also someone was asking about what are we going to do about people stashing their money away in the British Virgin Islands and Caymans and stuff like that.
My challenge to Caroline was really about being fiscally responsible, because I do believe, as was suggested, that is what the public want to see. But when I'm asked what have we proposed, we've proposed reform of business rates. We've proposed reform of the planning system and a change to the housing market. It was us that proposed scrapping the non-dom status. I'm glad that the Tories are now taking that on. It was us that proposed a windfall tax. They've taken it on in part, but they've not done it on full on North Sea oil and gas. Those are a set of proposals that are around growth. We can then get to skills and our FE colleges and how we invest in the future. That is a proper plan for growth. It does feel to me that flying a kite in the papers before a budget is not something that a responsible politician says, oh, yeah, we might do that, we might do this. I want to see what actually is going to happen. I saw what happened before under Liz Truss, and as a consequence, people are paying higher premiums on their mortgages than ever before in our country. That is what happened, and that is why this is such a serious subject.
OK. Yeah. Let me briefly, yeah.
I just wanted to come back on the issue of investment, because everyone's saying we want investment, and indeed we do, but we have the lowest private investment in the whole of the G7, and we recognise that public investment is absolutely crucial to give the private sector the confidence they need in order to be crowded in as well. So if we are looking at it from the pure lens of what is good for the British economy, then I can promise you properly investing in public services is what we need to be doing, and indeed investing in the green economy. And it is a cause of great disappointment that the Labour Party has now done its U-turn on that £28 billion, because that wouldn't only have been good in terms of the environmental consequences, it would have been good in terms of the economy as a whole, because it would have got some of much needed investment into all kinds of new technologies that now aren't going to be there, as well as properly insulating people's homes. So let's hear it for investment. It's absolutely what we need to be doing. Britain is at the bottom, as I say, of the G7 when it comes to private investment, and we need more of it now.
OK. Let's move on and take another question. From Catherine Stewart. Yes.
Should this country bring in a law to allow assisted dying?
Now, you're asking this today, Catherine, and the Health Select Committee has just released a report on assisted dying. It's not calling for a parliamentary vote, but says there is evidence there that could inform a debate. The government has not called for a vote, but says should there be one. it's indicated it would allow a free vote on this. Tim?
I'm a Catholic, and we're against assisted dying. But this is the subject, probably, of all Catholic social positions where I struggle the most, partly because I have seen people die, and I understand how messy, humiliating and painful it can be. And as the population lives longer, and we see greater incidence of dementia, and partly as a consequence of things like austerity, people looking after their relatives by themselves, this creates an added sense of burden and responsibility. And I understand, therefore, why there is greater interest and why this debate has come up at this time. I still hold back from it, though. And I hold back for a number of reasons. One, because where it has been done, there was initially a promise that it would remain only people who are terminally ill, but the definition of who can access it has grown and grown. It's become younger people, people with mental health problems, not just people who are physically ill. So there's always the problem of the wedge always seems to inevitably expand. There's the problem also of people, again, in a climate of poverty, people feeling like they are a burden and maybe choosing assisted dying rather than being a burden on their families or on their society. And I think that would be a tragedy. There's also the problem that you will get people who will abuse any system, who will pressure relatives to do things. So for all of those basic reasons, I'm against it. But there is also one big sort of philosophical one, which is up until now in our civilization, we've regarded medical practice as being about preserving life and trying to reduce suffering. If you legalize assisted dying, you civilizationally switch things. Suddenly, medicine becomes also about ending life. And at the heart of my social theology, what motivates me is a profound belief that life is precious. And that we have a responsibility as a community to help people, to stand by them, to accompany them, and to hold on to life as much as possible. In the wake of the Second World War, there was a great movement against death across the West. That's when you saw the death penalty being banned. That's when you saw campaigns against the bomb. And I worry that actually the West is moving a little bit in the other way at the moment, that whether it be the return of war or defense spending or this pressure for people to be able to end their lives early, it just seems almost as though death is coming back into fashion. And I think that's motivated in part by people being treated like economic units. There's all this language around, are you productive? Are you useful? Are you a burden on society? That's got to stop. At the heart of society is love of life and wanting to preserve it and hold on to it. And the moment that we civilizationally give up on that, I'm afraid I really do think we open the door to a great evil that we will struggle to control.
Sayeeda.
You know, I was sat here listening to Tim and I was saying, yes, I agree with everything he's saying. And in theory, again, as a Muslim and the importance of life, I would take exactly those positions. But in more recent years, I found myself shifting on this debate. I've read too many testimonies of people at end of life. I've read the testimonies of what life is, what quality of life that is for them, especially where they are at the end of life, and it is so obvious that they are at the end of life. And I increasingly want to see, a parliamentary debate on it. I want to see a parliamentary vote on it. I want to have more than actually just Parliament voting on it. I would like to see some element of maybe citizenship juries or local referenda. I want to have the public involved in this debate because this will be a unique shift to a different position that the United Kingdom has not taken before. But I am also of the view that if the message comes back that this is something that they would like Parliament to consider, then it would have to be done in a way which is controlled, managed, regulated, both in terms of the legal positions and the medical positions, and in the most exceptional of circumstances at the end of life. And I think it's really important. We're talking here about assisted dying, and there are so many different kind of permutations that people talk about: euthanasia, assisted suicide. We're talking here about a very, very narrow case. I think it is something that we should definitely consider, and I know from a personal perspective, and I have these conversations with my family, that there are circumstances where if I was at that end of life moment, I would like to be able to make those choices.
Okay. Over there with the glasses.
I think more money should have been put into the NHS, so we wouldn't be talking about this.
What, into palliative care, for example?
Yeah, life is precious. I've worked in the care sector and I've had to leave because it's unbearable to see. You don't have time to care for people because you're constantly shouted at, you need to get to this person, lack of funding. not even funding for one-to-one or basics. And this, if the Tory government would have funded the NHS and social care, we would not be talking about people taking their own lives, because life is precious.
And the woman next to you.
We already have a divided system. If you have the money, you can go to Switzerland and do it. People in this country have the right to do it as well.
So we should have a sort of version of that here, is that what you're saying?
I don't see why somebody who is... I recently had a friend who died in absolute agony, who desperately wanted to end her own life, but did not have the money to go to Dignitas.
It's about £10,000, I was looking
20.
it up. 20?
20.
Oh, okay.
Surely we should be able to give people who have the cognition to make that decision themselves, to actually help them, rather than let them die in absolute agony, which is what some people are doing.
Okay. David. Now, David, correct me if I got this wrong, there was a bill to legalise assisted dying in the UK in 2015, and I think you voted against that.
Probably. So, like Tim, like Sayeeda, I have a faith that's important to me. There have been a few votes of conscience for parliamentarians whilst I've been in Parliament. Same-sex marriage was in that category, and I voted for same-sex marriage. There was stem cell research and embryology, fertilisation. Again, I voted for those things. I think the time has come to bring this to Parliament, and Parliament should have the debate, and there should be the discussion.
And how would you see it?
Well, that's what my starting point is thinking of my mother, who died of ovarian cancer back in 2008. And I do worry a lot that the people I see advocating for this tend to be middle class, tend to have a lot of agency, are more on the secular end of the debate. I worry that someone like my mother might have felt a burden to her children. And I certainly have come across families in the constituency where there might have been pressure from children.
And when the woman here talks about people dying in agony,
my concern is the safeguards would have to be in place. So if this comes to Parliament, I will listen with an open mind. And there are sometimes you sit there and the debate and listening to colleagues moves you to a place, and I might vote for this. But my starting point is that based on Christian faith. I believe in the dignity of life. I'm worried about the idea that it's now up to human beings to decide when life should end, and Tim, as a Catholic, will understand where I'm coming from on that. But I am open to the discussion because, of course, I've known relatives, friends, constituents who have died horribly and painfully and feel that this should be something in their control. I just want to make a call out, though. Please let us support the wonderful nurses and carers. I'm thinking of people like the Marie Curie, who do a wonderful job with palliative care, and not lose sight of the very special role they play in this debate and this discussion.
Karen.
So the issue of palliative care has come up a couple of times, and I just want to really emphasise that I don't think there has to be any division between much better palliative care, which we undoubtedly need in this country, and support for assisted dying, and that is something that I do support. But I recognise that, for example, in my own constituency or in Brighton and Hove, there's a wonderful hospice, Martlet's, and it spends all its time trying to fundraise because there isn't enough money coming from government or from the Integrated Care Board. And so I think we have a wonderful movement in this country, the hospice movement, and it should be properly funded so that people aren't scared at the end of life. But having said that, there will still be people, however good our palliative care is, who can't be helped in that way and do, I think, have a right to end their lives. And I absolutely take the point that the lady said here about, of course, some people can't afford to go to Dignitas. If they do go to Dignitas with a family member, then they face an absolutely awful situation with the family member when they come back, being potentially investigated and even potentially prosecuted. So it's a terrible situation for those people right now. How much better would it be, precisely because life is precious, precisely because because, you know, I believe in the dignity of life too, to allow someone under very strict restrictions and what's been proposed before, you know, had all kinds of safeguards in there. It is when you're talking about someone with a prognosis of fewer than 6 months to live. It has a judge involved, it has several doctors involved, it has an amount of time involved. But how much better to allow that person to be able to die with their family and friends around them at a time of their choosing in a way that is in sync with the rest of their life. And this is something that I care about very deeply. I've been actually training to accompany people towards the end of life because, frankly, in this country, we do death so badly. We don't have enough discussion about it. I disagree with people who think we've done death to death. We haven't. Death is the last taboo. We need to be talking about it more within families, within society, and somehow reach away. And I think the idea, as Sayeeda mentioned, of citizens' assemblies and juries would be a really, really helpful way of having that debate.
Okay. We've not got much time left, but I want to squeeze this last question in because this also is extremely important. So, Tim Shelley, let's hear from you.
When and how do the panel think the war in the Ukraine is likely to end?
When and how do the panel think the war in Ukraine is likely to end? David.
We have to continue to assist Ukraine, and this is obviously not just the UK, it's America, much of the Western world, and certainly our European partners, with the arms and the aid that is necessary. We cannot allow Putin to claim significant portions of that country, to get to a point of victory, and then to look to Moldova and other parts of the region that he can claim as well. And I do believe that whilst there's a lot of debate at the moment about the United States and Congress and finding the money, and I've been to Washington to absolutely stress the point that for us here in the UK, this is not a partisan issue. Of course they should support the fight for freedom.
But the question, David, is when and how do the panel think the war in Ukraine will end?
Well,
that's the question, not whether we should continue to support it, but how will it
must end with us bringing Putin to heel. That's how it must end. Because the consequences of Putin winning is disastrous for our quality of life and our freedoms that we enjoy.
And do you have any idea how long that could possibly take? I mean, I know it's like how long is a piece of string, but nonetheless, if the EU, Britain, the Americans are going to continue to support Ukraine, this must be something that you discuss. How long can this go on?
My sense is that Putin is waiting out 2024. He knows that there's an election in America. He knows that might have some influence on the outcome of Ukraine. So I can't see anything coming to an end this year. We then get into 2025. There may be a big decision for Europe as a consequence of decisions in the United States. I still think they'll find the money this year. Trump says that he can fix this on day one, within 24 hours. Let's see if he pulls that off.
Okay.
Maybe
all right.
he can.
Let me get around the rest of the panel.
We then get into 2025 and 2026 and beyond. But we have to ensure that Ukraine prevails.
Okay. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so we have to be reasonably, I'd like to be in the audience as well, Sayeeda. So when and how? I'll be amazed if anyone on this panel says we should keep supporting Ukraine. So let's take that as a given. When and how do the panel think the war in the Ukraine is likely to end?
Well, the way it will be fixed is through political agreement. This war is not going to be won militarily. We've seen both the United States and Russia at various times go into countries thinking they were going to fix those countries and win those wars within days.
But is it realistic to think that Ukraine can push Russia out?
No,
this
war is not going to be won militarily on either side. In the end, there will have to be a political discussion. But unfortunately, Putin has showed, and it happened in 2014 when he first invaded Crimea, that he is not going to abide by a political agreement. We had several political agreements, Minsk 1, 2, 3. He didn't abide by those. So I think in the end, depending on what happens in the United States, depending on what the appetite is, how difficult it gets for Russia, and at the moment, unfortunately, it's not getting difficult for Russia because their economy is doing better than they anticipated, and he's winning the ground war as well in certain places. But I think we just have to find the political pressure. The easiest thing in the world to do is start a war. The hardest thing in the world to do is to stop it.
Tim.
Interestingly, we were discussing life and ethics of life earlier. My view is that sometimes a war is a tragic necessity, but it's always evil. And one has to look to how one reduces suffering and death as much as possible. So I think the answer is that this is now a stalemate war, and that it has to be resolved through political dialogue as speedily as possible in order to bring it to a close.
What would that look like, given that Putin is showing no signs of wanting to relinquish the territory that he's gained? The Ukrainians, understandably, saying no sign of wanting to hand that over.
Yes.
So what does that diplomacy look like?
Here is the problem, is that the West has raised two impossible standards. One is the restoration of Ukrainian territory. That's probably not going to happen. In fact, some in the West, like Truss and Boris, were even suggesting the return of Crimea in their language, which was preposterous. So he's probably not going to give in on that. And the second thing was Ukraine's future membership of NATO. Again, that's going to be an absolute red line in negotiations for Russia. So the answer to the original question is I think probably will be resolved post-election, I agree. It's probably going to be resolved in a way which is deeply unsatisfying. But it might be that the West just has to accept that that it was a victory to prevent Putin's complete crushing of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have fought incredibly bravely. The West was right to support them in doing that. But in order to reduce the tragic loss of life which is continuing on both sides, I think it would be perfectly reasonable and civilized to reopen negotiations with an open mind at this point.
Caroline?
I'm just really worried that we are massively still underestimating Putin. I think if he can get away with having secured some land in Ukraine, then where does he go next? He goes to Poland and he goes elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And I think he is quite terrifying. And I think we really need to recognise the scale of the threat that he poses. I think there is still more that we could be doing when it comes to sanctions. And I know last week you were talking about closing some of the sanction loopholes that there are in the UK, whereby, for example, we are still sending money to the Kremlin because of importing Russian oil that's been refined elsewhere. So we need to close that loophole. We need to look more at sanctions. We need to look more at the Russian money that's still sloshing around London. We need to look at the Russia report. I've actually even taken the government to court over the so-called Russia report. This was a report that talked about the fact that there is credible evidence of Russian interference in our own electoral system over the referendum and other elections and elsewhere. Overall, I just feel government after government is basically not realising the scale of that threat that Putin faces.
But what should they do, other than more sanctions, closing the sanctions? Realistically, what can people do?
Well, what they can do, for example, is yes, more sanctions, but if necessary, more, and this comes quite a difficult thing for me as a Green to say, but potentially more support for the people fighting in Ukraine, because I worry at the moment we're giving them just enough so they don't lose, but not enough so they win. And when you've got the money being blocked in the US as well, it feels as if we are letting them down in a very significant way. So I think this is, it's on the edge of the Third World War. This is massively, massively important, and I worry that we're not taking it seriously.
But if we're not willing,
very quickly, because I won't have time.
If we're not willing to commit more, and when France floated the possibility of military advisors entering the country, Putin threatened a nuclear response. If we're not willing to risk more, then why continue a slaughter when we already know what the outcome is going to be?
David, I'm so sorry. David, I know you want to take issue with that, and Kel, I'm sure you do too, but we're actually over time, so forgive me, I'm going to have to end it there. I don't doubt, and I'm very sad to say that, of course, we will return to the subject on the war in Ukraine, because there's certainly, as you say, David, no sign of it ending anytime soon. Our hour is over. In fact, we are over our hour, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to all of you here in Croydon for coming along, and thank you to you at home for watching. From Question Time, bye-bye.